This video introduces the field of comparative politics. I'll be talking about what is comparative politics and why do we compare and how do we compare, and then a little bit about how we categorize the world in political science. So first, what is comparative politics? It's the subfield of political science that draws conclusions based on comparing different countries to each other. And there are several ways to do this. Now, why do we do this? We do it because we do not have a lab. We are social scientists, we are political scientists, and as such, we have difficulties going out and isolating variables. And comparative politics is our way of trying to do that. We try to identify the causes that might not be immediately identifiable if we're just looking at a single political system. So when we compare different countries to each other, we can get closer to finding what variable might cause a particular effect. And this is then very much building on how we compare. The empiricist perspective is very, very strong in this subfield. Very many of us who work with comparative politics use statistical data to compare many countries at once. We can have very large samples. But even single cases can be used if they're used in an implicitly comparative manner. Comparisons can draw out similarities and differences between the cases to identify, as I mentioned, that causal variable, the cause of the phenomenon. So some examples then of very large samples would be Inglehart's World Value Survey. Inglehart doesn't necessarily compare countries as much as people to each other, but he does plot the countries. The World Value Survey does plot the countries over a spectrum. So this is a survey that goes out to thousands of people across the world in every single country that they can get a hold of. And the people in these countries get to fill out the survey, and the results show what kind of values they have, ostensibly. And then those results are plotted across a graph to show differences between values between different parts of the world. So that's the largest sample you can probably get when you're trying to basically compare the entire world to each other in a single study. A smaller sample would be Theda Skocpol's work on states and social revolutions, comparing the French, Russian, and Chinese revolutions to each other. And this is then to find the cause and effect of various different institutional contexts and how they impact the outcome of the revolution. So that's an example of trying to isolate variables. And then we can talk about single case, in this case a single country, Putnam's study of civil society in Italy, where Putnam is essentially comparing the north of Italy to the south of Italy. So Italy is the constant, and then Putnam is trying to discern why the civil society has developed differently in different parts of the countries of this country. Part of the work of the comparativist is to categorize the world and spot differences, large-scale differences, if you will. We have different ways of doing this. We can do it based on economic labels, so what are the economic properties of the different countries in question, or we can do it based on the system of government. The more common way is actually doing it relating to the economy. So here we have the developed versus developing states type of categorization, where developing would be countries like Brazil and Libya, and developed would be Germany. This is, again, based on economy, economical infrastructure, GDP per capita, and you'd have countries like Western Europe and countries of Western Europe and North America, Australia, New Zealand, Japan. They are the leading post-industrial economies in the system of global capitalism, and they would be the developed states and countries that have benefited from post-war economic developments. And every other country would be a developing country by this measure. The problem here is that the word developing implies an ongoing process. What is the goal? Is it to become like the Western countries? That might not be the goal for other countries. They might have their own vision of what system and what type of society they want to have. Is there an ongoing process, or is there a status quo? That's a very good question and an important one. We try to track this. There's various ways of tracking the development of a country. The Human Development Index is one, and it's really a point of contention. Development can be wrongly applied to spheres outside the economic, which might lead to ethnocentrism. So American political science in the 1950s and 60s assumed that the US political system is the most developed. And by that rationale, countries like Germany, Denmark, Canada, France would be less developed than the United States, which of course the citizens of those respective countries probably will disagree with emphatically. And again, if you ask that question outside the Western world, you might get similar rejections. The goal might not be to become the likeness of the United States or Western countries. So this has been an ongoing debate, and even aside from those problems, we still have difficulties with the categories as this label has been developed. There are not many similarities today between some countries in the so-called developing world. Some countries have forged ahead and become richer since these labels were devised. Brazil and Libya are today in very different situations. Because of economic developments in the 90s and in the early decade of the 21st century. So lumping them together in the same category might not be a good idea. The first, second, and third world is another classic label based on Cold War alliances. The first would be the countries allied with the United States. The second would be the communist states tied to the Soviet Union. And the third would be every other country. But of course, the Cold War ended a long time ago. There is no longer a second world. And now this label has clung. The third world label and the first world label, they've kind of stuck around anyway. Because the third world has been seen as very much synonymous to developing countries in the previous set of labels. But it's still, so that means that the label has shifted to be one that invokes economy rather than global alliances. But again, we have the same problems as we had with the developing and developed states. So what commonalities do you have between India and Zimbabwe at this stage? And so on. Global North versus Global South. This is based on global political economy. Now, the ambition in this set of labels is to show how global socioeconomic differences have corresponded to geographic positions. We see that most of the rich countries are in the north, with the exception of Australia and New Zealand. Most of the poor countries are in the south. And the goal for the people who designed this set of labels is to reveal how rich former colonial powers keep exploiting former colonies. Even though they're not formally colonies anymore, they're still in a state of economic subjugation. But socioeconomic differences, again, do not necessarily correspond terribly well to geography. So we can say one thing for all these three sets of labels. It is that since the 1970s and 1980s, the world in general has developed so much that these do not capture very well the different types of countries that we will see in the world. There are rich countries, high-income countries, there are middle-income countries, and there are low-income countries. And so perhaps it is time now to go beyond these two simple labels. For instance, people talking about Global North and Global South will have a difficult time explaining why so many countries in East Asia have emerged as strong economies, even though they might have been exploited in the past. How did they break that? Are they still exploited? Indonesia has had tremendous success, economic success, over the past couple of decades. And the same can be said for Vietnam, India, and so on. These labels have not aged well. Another way of labeling different countries is related to the system of government. We can talk about entrenched democracies, transitional democracies, and authoritarian states or totalitarian states, although there are not many totalitarian states now. Entrenched democracies are countries that have fully functioning democracy, and often the country will have a long tradition of democracy, that's why it's entrenched. Whereas transitional democracies are countries that have some democratic institutions and practices, but lack some fundamental features to be called fully democratic. Elections might not be completely free and fair. The press might be constrained in various ways. There might be an opposition party, but they might struggle to field candidates and reach out with their message and so on. Whereas authoritarian states have no genuinely democratic practices at all. So it's a straight up autocracy in some kind of fashion. The problem here is how we do we draw the line between the entrenched democracies, the transitional democracy, and an authoritarian regime. The word transitional implies that there is an ongoing movement towards democracy, but some countries have been transitional for decades. Maybe the country is not moving anywhere, and some countries might move towards an entrenched democracy and develop the democracy and then backtrack. This also does not necessarily directly reveal global economic standing. Singapore is an authoritarian state. It's not a democracy at all, and yet it's one of the richest places on the planet. It's an outlier. Most dictatorships also tend to be poor, to be fair. And we can ask questions about some countries in Europe right now. Say Hungary, for instance, there's a lot of controversy around Viktor Orban's reforms within Hungary. There is a lot of discussion about whether it is slipping into some kind of authoritarian state. Exactly where the line is drawn between each category, it is gray and fuzzy and not terribly clear. So that's an introduction then to comparative politics and some labels that we use to categorize the world, troubled as they might